Irene Barbiera, donc, qui nous fait aussi le plaisir de participer à cette table ronde, a consacré sa thèse d'histoire médiévale aux migrations durant les invasions lombardes. Et elle a rejoint ensuite l'Université de Padoue et son département de sciences statistiques, donc comme chercheuse. Elle a publié plusieurs ouvrages en italien et en anglais, parmi lesquels on peut citer le livre issu de sa thèse, Changing Lands in Changing Memories, Migration and Identity During the Lombard Invasions, qui est publié en 2005, et plus récemment un livre sur les mémoires ensevelies et les liens entre tombe et identité au Haut Moyen-Âge. Elle a également dirigé un dossier, des actes de colloque sur les transgressions de genre au Moyen-Âge, qui est sorti en 2015. Dans son intervention de cet après-midi, elle va revenir sur les grandes migrations du Haut Moyen-Âge, en montrant que celles-ci ont longtemps été pensées comme essentiellement masculines, comme des déplacements également de groupes cohérents d'un point de vue ethnique, et donc elle va, je pense, en grande partie revenir sur ces représentations communes et essayer de les nuancer, en partant notamment d'une étude des vestiges archéologiques et d'une analyse des restes de ces migrantes et des tombes.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting roundtable. And sorry, I will speak in English, and even worse, I will read my paper because I thought there will be an official translation, but then I will try to read slowly so you can understand. So my approach is really historiographical, so I will not go into details on the interpretation of early medieval migrations, but I will talk how these migrations were read and interpreted between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So modern historians and archaeologists of the 19th and 20th century who studied the migrations of the ancient world were affected by the contemporaneous great transoceanic migrations in a very contradictory way. It has been stressed that historians are strongly influenced by the academic discourses and the cultural paradigm of the period in which they live, and no less is true in the case of scholars dealing with the early Middle Ages, a complex and debated historical period marked by the end of the Roman world and the foundation of the Roman and barbarian kingdoms. According to traditional interpretation, these kingdoms were founded by different tribes of barbarians invading and settling within the Roman empires. Thus, the Anglo-Saxon founded the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the Franks founded the Frankish kingdom, and so on. And this kingdom gave rise to modern nations. So, from this perspective, early medieval tribes were perceived as the ancestor of different modern European nations. The name given to this migration movement in different languages, Völkerwanderung, migrazione dei popoli, migration des people, great migrations, are expressive of the ideological meanings with which they were imbued. In fact, in interpreting the forms and dynamics of early medieval migrations, scholars of the late 19th and 20th century selected only some aspects of the migration experience they were witnessing. So, on the one hand, they put big emphasis on the greatness of the stock which was moving. So, the great migrations were huge movement of huge groups of people, big huge of people. But on the other side, they ignore completely the dynamics of the migration movements which they witnessed during the 18th, 19th, 20th century. So they saw these migrations as the mass movement of coherent ethnic groups. Each migrating tribe was characterized by its own language and culture, which moved and spread within Europe. Settlement of migrants and contact with natives was presented mirroring the colonial experience in terms of acculturation. However, there were at times different opinions among scholars from different countries as to whom acculturated whom. For Germans, barbarian tribes were progressive ones, acculturating the flabby Romans. For Italians, on the other hand, barbarians were the retrogrades, and their invasions meant the end of the great Roman Empire. Apart from positive or negative attitudes, all agreed that early medieval migrations were great. large groups of people move within Europe, bringing large changes. All these changes were visible mainly through funerary remains, which preserve the traces of ancient bodies accompanied by lavish grave goods. The combined study of material remains to written sources was developed to trace specifically the roots of the migrations. It is, however, the combination of these different sources and the strong influence of racial and nationalistic discourses of the time that led to the formulation of very peculiar interpretative models of mass migration across Europe, in which the agency of males and females resulted in a very contradictory effects. So in this short presentation, I will try to investigate how scholars try to reconciliate the particularly emphasis on the migratory movements of soldiers, on males, based on written sources, with that of post-Roman archaeological data, which, on the other side, reveals the particular importance of the female graves. So we have different kind of emphasis on males and females if we look at written and archaeological sources. So I will try to show how this evidence was then framed into the male-centric nationalistic discourse, which reached its apex during the Second World War. Different written sources of the early medieval period present migratory movements of barbarian groups in different ways and leave open questions on what should be understood by the term used by the medieval authors to designate different tribes, so who the Lombards, the Franks, the Alamans, and the other were. The ancient sources, contemporary to the events, contemporary to the movements, present barbarian groups as bands of soldiers of mixed origin, with whom the empire had to cope, sometimes fighting against them, some other times obtaining their alliances in exchange for land where barbarians could settle, and which in some cases they could control and rule, giving rise to barbarian kingdoms. There is, however, another group of literary sources called Origogentium, which are mythical sagas and which were written some century later after barbarian kingdoms were founded. These texts had the aim of legitimizing the new founded kingdoms, describing barbarian groups as ancient people who, starting from a land of common origin, would march through Europe, having overcome many heroic deeds along their way, to the promised land where they finally found the new kingdoms. These texts, following the biblical model of the Exodus, presented the complex chessboard of displacement, war, and alliances between barbarians and empire, like linear mass migrations of coherent ethnic groups moving all at once. So the idea was that there were huge groups of people moving all together. A list of questions arises. Were early medieval migration really like this? How large were the groups that moved? For instance, in the case of the Lombard migration to Italy, it has been claimed that about 100 and 150,000 individuals entered the peninsula coming from northeast and crossing the Alps all at once. So they imagine a huge horde of people coming through the mountains. How could technically such huge horde of male, females, and children march across the mountains? How should we imagine that? So historians and anthropologists between the end of the 19th, 20th century accepted the narrative of the Origogentium as a reliable source. So they took this text literally, imagining these kind of immigrations. They imagine ancient barbarian groups as populations sharing a common origin who moved compactly, carrying their staff and bringing all sorts of innovations. This fact would have been visible in funerary remains, which shows clear signs of drastic change after the settlement. Taller individuals started to be buried with new funerary rituals and with new ways of being dressed. These ideas imply that barbarian groups were coherent biologically and ethnically, and that they share a common material culture which remained unchanged through the routes of their migration. And this approach was developed even further between the two world wars. Barbarian tribes were associated with the Nordic race, tall, light blue eyes, rosy white skin. Hans Günther, in his 1927 volume, The Racial Elements of European History, distinguished 5 major races in Europe: the Nordic, the Alpine, the Dinaric, the Balkanic, and the Mediterranean. And each would be identified by bodily and mental characteristics. The Nordic and the Mediterranean race were at the two extremes and were evaluated through the behavior of men. I'm quoting: Nordic man has always been and always will be led by his lust for competition, for culture, for leadership, and for distinction. The Nordic race seems to show special attitude in the domain of military science, owing to its warlike spirit. On the contrary, the Mediterranean race is passionate, excitable. Mediterranean man is very strongly swayed by the sexual life, at least is not so continent as the Nordic race, end quotation. Another important characteristic attributed to the Mediterranean race is that it has lived under mother right institutions, that is, kingship and inheritance was terminated not through the father but through the mother. While differently among the Nordic people, father right is found everywhere. I'm quoting. Among them, the conception of married faithfulness is developed. End quotation. In different historical periods, flows of Nordic blood moved from the north to the south of Europe and the Mediterranean thanks to migrations. The progression of ancient Greek and Roman civilization was due to the transmission of Nordic traits and characters. I'm quoting: under late Roman emperors, who were often of Germanic blood, there was such a stream of Germanic mercenaries into the Roman army, who finally settled within the Italian border, that with this time a fresh flow of Nordic blood into the Roman Empire began. So migrations brought the blood of the Nordic groups into Europe. However, after some centuries, Nordic blood slowly runs dry. The declined Roman Empire was now mainly peopled by a mixture of pre-Roman Mediterranean race with very much Semitic blood. It was the end of everything. The true Roman Nordic creative power were exhausted. The empire went away of its fall and was finally brought to an end by the last Nordic wave, the invading Germans. This last wave of Nordic blood is known under the name of Wandering of the Peoples. It laid the foundations for the European state system of today. End quotation. So, according to Hans Günther, throughout the course of history, fresh blood always came from the north. It was brought by Nordic men and was transmitted from father to son by Nordic father-right rule of transmission. Early medieval waves of migration were the last movement of such Nordic blood, which raised the fate of Europe thanks to the agency of males. Females, as inferior beings, were silent mothers and passive bearers of valorous males. Even their role in procreation was belittled, racial traits being transmitted from male to male. Inferiority of female was a spread idea shared by scholars from different countries. In his book, Se vi sono donne di genio, if there are intelligent women, edited in 1893 by Giuseppe Sergi, who was an anthropologist, and mainly a physical anthropologist in Italy, Sergi writes, I'm quoting, morphologically and functionally, the woman does not achieve normal male development, but on every age, she remains behind, as if there was a general stagnation of development. And also, The great eucalyptus of Australia in Italy do not reach the enormous development of the country of origin. So are the masculine characters when they pass into the female sex. End quotation. And we should note this. One of CERHiC's students at the time, when he was writing this, was Maria Montessori, who paradoxically was to become much more famous than CERHiC himself. I think none of you heard about CERHiC, but you heard about Maria Montessori. So Otto Wenninger, in his Sex and Character, he's an Austrian anthropologist, published in 1903, goes even further, I'm quoting. The female, moreover, is completely occupied in contact with sexual matters, whilst men are interested in much else, in war and sport, in social affair and fasting, in philosophy and science, in business and politics, in religion and art. She takes no real interest in things themselves. The female principle is then nothing more than sexuality. The male principle is sexuality and something more. So, end quotation. So the females were seen as a mechanic procreators. If there was a general agreement about gender and female roles, the superiority of Nordic warriors and the role attributed to Völkerwanderung in shaping modern Europe, which was mainly promoted by German scholars, was not accepted in Italy and France. In France, the undeniable presence of barbarians was nevertheless diminished. Fuster de Coulanges writes, for instance, at the end of the 19th century, I'm quoting, the establishment of Germans in Gaul could not have had the important effect that have been usually attributed. The blood was not altered because Germans were not so numerous. End quotation. Italian fascists instead glossed the Germans and promoted the Roman period as the glorious phase of the European history. It was Roman soldiers and not the barbarians, warriors, who became the model for Italian masculinity. I'm quoting. No, Mussolini himself was described as the, I'm quoting, reincarnation of the Roman legionary, since he possessed a broad breast and the concise lucidity of the Latin mind. End quotation. Nonetheless, in spite of positive or negative approaches to German invasions, warriors were at this time the model for masculinity. The glorification of war and the celebration of warriors became particularly significant to justify human sacrifice, particularly during Second World War. Masculinity became a political instrument and warrior virility the symbol of the nation. Male citizens sacrificed themselves for their fatherland. So in this context, archaeology played a special role in finding the traces of ancient heroes, and here is Mussolini in Rome starting an archaeological excavation. Archaeological research became particularly important during the 19th century as a tool to forge national consciousness, since it deals with material culture, which represent a tangible memory of the past and can therefore be understood by a great range of people. Moreover, archaeology as a non-written source is very open to different interpretations. It can be very much debated. It's very much debated. From this perspective, archaeological remains were seen as the expression of coherent cultural milieus, which could be associated with different ethnic groups occupying specific regions in the past. Gustav Cossina, one of the developers of this method, of this approach, which is called cultural history paradigm, writes in 1911, I'm quoting, in all historical periods, distinct material cultures in different areas corresponds to different tribes, end quotation. And when groups migrated, their core culture moved with them. So from this point of view, all innovation and changes which are visible in the archaeological record were interpreted as the results of immigration of new groups. The material culture of barbarian group was thus read according to this paradigm. Barbarians were characterized by their own material culture, which was essentially preserved along the long path of their migrations. And after settling within the empire, so they were conservative and maintained material culture which allowed to distinguish them. It was mainly the traditional costume, the way of dressing found in graves, that was assumed to remain unchanged. Its displayed in graves was understood as a strategy of distinction against the autochthonous population, who had a contrasting different culture. In short, the clothing individuals were buried wearing was interpreted as a kind of passport, as a sign marking each individual's origin. As Huber-Fair has shown, it was particularly the Nazis that promoted archaeological research of early medieval cemeteries. Within the Ostforschung project, Hans Zeiss and Franz Petri were conducting archaeological excavation, respectively in Spain and Gaul, and identified the cemeteries in Rho, the Rheingraberfeld, as the burial places of the Visigoths and the Franks. They tried to use grave goods, which include mainly dress elements, to identify the traditional costume of German groups versus the Roman. They had the idea that graves with iron and metal objects were to be attributed to barbarians, while Romans were those without any iron or metal in it. Thus, metal objects and fitting were used to reconstruct the traditional costume, the Tracht, of ancient German tribes. However, archaeology has a surprise in reserve. Irony of fate, the most striking metal objects, particularly in Spain and also in Italy, were brooches and other female types of jewelry. In cemeteries of the early medieval period, females had a greater visibility than males. Thus, the traditional costume of barbarians could be reconstructed mainly on the basis of the female costume. Thus, after all, discourses on female could not be avoided, but they still remained passive pawns moved by males. They followed the route of the Grey migrations, carrying the cultural traits of their people. So because women were the bearer of tradition, the traditional way of dressing remained unchanged through the routes of migration. So for instance, I'm quoting, in all the continental Germanic world, a Germanic woman could be easily recognized for her clothing, which was different from that of the other German ancestries. So they tried to reconstruct different traditional costumes of different barbarians using the female burials. This shows a remarkable, I'm quoting, conservatorism. So females dress conservatively while passively following their husband who conquered the Roman world. Thus, the steps of early medieval migratory movements could be following the development of brooches. So we have the steps of migrations, which are described by the written sources describing movement of male warriors, which archaeologically are followed by the traces of female artifact types. Very often, a great mixture of objects of different shape and style were found in the same grave, and this is an example, which were not interpreted as the results of trade or exchange, but rather as the consequence of complex migratory routes. So, for instance, in this case, the lady from this grave of Ficarolo in northern Italy, who was buried with typical Gepid, Alemannic, and Gothic grave goods, was defined as a lady of turbulent fate who was born in the Carpathian Basin, where Gepids were settled, then got married and moved to Alemannia, and when the Alamans were defeated by the Franks, then she escaped as a refugee in Italy, where she was finally buried, with all the proofs of her peregrinations. To conclude, early medieval migration had a special role in legitimating national assets and land claims. It is not by chance that Hitler, after reading archaeological reports written by Franz Petri, stated, I'm quoting, "These are ancient German lands which were stolen from us and which we can rightfully demand to be given back to us." End quotation. Because of this period of the Great Migration was imbued with nationalistic and racial ideas, and despite of the fact that more complex and elaborated theories of migration and integration were already developed at the time, they were not applied to this specific historical period. In the same way, stereotypical models of warrior-like masculinity and subjective femininity were forced onto ancient sources, even if they did not really fit. After gender studies were developed within the field of migration studies and later in medieval archaeology, after the 90s of the last century, it became clear that archaeological, written, and osteological sources clearly show more complex migration dynamics than the mass migration of entire people. Moreover, the migrations of females did not necessarily follow the male movements. On the contrary, as many recent works have shown, they could play very important roles in establishing alliances between aristocratic and ruling families through their marriages. And as you show also in a completely different period, but we had similar dynamics in the early medieval period as well. And thus, females could move independently from their fathers, brothers, and husbands. More recently, research on the early Middle Ages has shown that in this period, characterized by great political instability, females from powerful families could play very important roles and act very independently, have been active in the relations between different families. In spite of this evidence, the period of the Great Migrations was assumed as the legitimating mirror of propaganda, and thus all its written and material sources were made to fit into preconceived ideas of family and gender models, in which females were passive followers of male and were containers of their children, even if at a closer look all the documentation seemed to testify just a completely different story. Okay, so.